Hey everybody, welcome to our presentation. In this video, we're going to talk about what we call the balance of power model of UCHA. These are a package of reforms written by myself, Crystal, and Derek, as well as many other current and past members that we think could help the co-op function in a more democratic, efficient, and coherent manner. As for introductions, my name is Taylor, and I served as the co-op's BOD president from 2020 to 2021. During which time I signed Woody's contract of offer to come work as the co-op's executive director. After serving as president, I spent the final year of my time at the co-op as the chair of the governance committee, which is when the reforms we're about to present to you today were drafted. It is both an honor and a pleasure to finally get to share with you everything that we worked on. So here some of the major contributors to this project are credited by name, but of course a dozen more members sat in on governance committee meetings and contributed their perspectives, which was essential to carrying this project out to completion. So in today's presentation, we're going to break it up into 4 pieces. First, we need to talk about the co-op's history. We need to know how we got to where we are today before we can consider ways of possibly improving the current system. Secondly, we're going to identify some of what we believe are the biggest issues with the current way the co-op works, what we term the de facto model. The third part is going to be the bulk of our presentation. We're going to talk about and discuss the details of the balance of power model itself and what it would actually look like to rearrange the relationships between the various bodies of UCHA. And fourth and finally, we're going to look ahead and talk a little bit about what implementing a change and a reform like this might actually look like. And without further ado, I'm going to pass the talking stick to the wonderful Crystal to talk about part 1, the history of the co-op.
All right. So I wanted to start with a little quote here from a document from the 2000s. It says, "The co-op was a worn-out, roach-infested place with lousy food. It was inefficient and full of petty squabbling. People loved it, really loved it in the deepest sense. It altered and illuminated their lives." I thought it captured the co-op's energy really well. And when we started around the time of the end of the Great Depression, and co-ops were very much in fashion. And here we have the cooperative principles below, and we'll have the slides shared afterwards where you can click on the teal links above, which link to the documents where we're crediting all of our information. So some important dates here. There's a lot, but I'll just highlight a couple. So we were founded in 1936, starting with Adam House and just 9 people. And then 1941, we got the Glass House, now Robeson. 1958, we got a scene. And then 1973 is when Triple H was built and opened. That effectively doubled our population, and maybe should have been a time when we should have rewritten our governance to manage that volume of people. Earl Klein is a big part of our history. He was our CPA in 2000s. He entered in 1941. He's the reason why we have 501c3 status, and he got our loan to build Triple H. In the book, in the history that he wrote this: "I came back to UCHA in June 1946 to put the accounting books, in good order. The financial records were nothing but canceled checks, unpaid student accounts, past due vendor bills, no bank reconcilements, journals that did not balance, and a general ledger that looked like it had been kept by some 3rd grade kids." And this has happened multiple times throughout UCHA's history, and it goes to show the importance of having effective staff and a good running BOD, especially a good accounting department, a good executive director, et cetera, et cetera. And some history of BOD and ED dysfunction. Fred said one of the problems was that no one could find the kickback money from the payphones. I took Fred to the office and showed him that the phone receipts were credited to the telephone expense and was traceable to the bank. My response, why didn't you guys ask instead of jumping to conclusions and blaming Pop, the ED at the time, for stealing the phone receipts? So in the past, if there's dysfunction between the board and the ED, some energy might be spent conducting investigations, et cetera, in place of having a cohesive relationship where things run smoothly. And we have Garlo Chow's letter from 1997. Look to the future, please. The board spends the majority of its energy on complicated and often controversial personnel considerations. The resulting effect on the overall improvement of UCHA has always been questionable at best. If personnel were the answer, surely there would be no reason for board candidates to announce that they want to bring changes to the co-op. Personnel action is managing and reacting to situations. Writing new policies is directing and proactively preventing problems from occurring. And the most important part here is that we do not need more managers. We need leaders, which is why we have that emphasis on directing and prevention rather than managing and reacting, which is what the personnel should do, but the board should be leaders instead. And once again, if you want to read his letter, it's linked in the teal link when we share our slides. I'll pass it off to Taylor for de facto governance.
All right, well, thank you so much, Crystal. That was a really great discussion on the history of the co-op and what some of the longest serving and people who have lived in the co-op have basically told us from the past, right? So the second part of our presentation, as I said, is about the current system of the co-op, right? What we have termed the de facto governance system. So what we have on the screen here is the organizational graph of this de facto system. It's in the cafeteria. Any of you can go down and look at it if you want today. Now, when we set out on this project, we of course had to figure out how does the co-op currently work before we can discuss possible changes to it, right? That's part of as well as understanding our history. So if you look at this graph, you roughly see the board is sort of in the center. You see a lot of arrows coming out of it, which means that they have the responsibility of overseeing a lot of bodies, 5 of them actually. And you see one arrow going into it. So this is really kind of our first big issue with the de facto system, that the board has an overwhelming number of oversight mechanisms and responsibilities, right? A level of responsibility that's almost untenable for any group of people to properly accomplish, especially a group that is supposed to be full-time students, right? So that is an issue that we see. Otherwise, if you look at the bottom, the boxes of the jurisdiction responsibilities, you see that red represents overlapping jurisdictions, right? And if you look at it, you see the board has the most red, right? So when we have overlapping jurisdiction or responsibility, that can be a frustrating experience, not only for members who don't know who is going to summon them or who gives them their credit for working a chore shift, but it can be frustrating for leadership as well, because maybe you thought you were going to do something that someone else does, and someone else did it in the past and maybe didn't do it to your standard of procedural properness. So again, these are a problem when too many responsibilities are overlapping. And finally, what I want to talk about from just looking at this organizational graph is a problem with accountability. Okay, so if you look at the board and the MemCom, you see that only one arrow is going to them, right? Which means that only one body in the co-op is responsible for overseeing them. Now, of course, members elect our board. They elect our membership committee. So they will undoubtedly be overseeing them through those elections and possible recalls. But this presents a problem. Members are, in fact, the least educated of all of the bodies of the UCHA on the way the co-op works, which means if a board is not functioning properly or MemCom is not, summoning people the way they should be or something like that, that it's going to be very hard for members to effectively use collective action in order to check the board or MemCom if they need to. So again, this presents a challenge of accountability. So here we're going to really highlight the key issues beyond the organizational graph in the last slide. First, confusion. Again, with the overlapping responsibilities, you have confusion of not knowing who is responsible for what. That is certainly an issue and a frustrating experience, as I said, for membership and leadership alike. Second big issue is inconsistency. When many bodies are responsible for summons of various kinds, or maybe appointing crew chiefs or crew chief bonuses, they might not, and very likely they won't, use the same procedural standards to carry out this business. In fact, a funny anecdote is that at one point in co-op history, MemCom was more consistent on summoning members than the board was. Now, anyone who's read the rules knows that MemCom summons members from 8 to 20 hours of deficiency, and the board summons for above 20 hours. But if the board is distracted by something else and not consistently summoning members for deficiency, but MemCom is, then at various times members have actually been incentivized to go to 20 hours of deficiency so that no one bothers them. Third big issue is burnout and depletion, right? If MemCom and especially BOD are overwhelmed by their responsibilities, then very rarely do we actually see members finishing their full year term, right? They're going to leave or resign before actually passing their knowledge on to the next generation. So beyond just it being bad when people resign because you have less people working in BOD and MemCom, you also get the double whammy of losing institutional knowledge and not having that informal training that normally would occur as new members come in and old members leave slowly. And finally, one of the biggest issues we see with the de facto model is no long-term strategic plan. Now, this can be summed up in terms of expansion, right? Expansion is big. If you read our bylaws, you see it's talked about in a whole article. But there's more to a strategic plan than just buying new property for new dorms. Perhaps improving kitchen meal options, maybe renovating our buildings on a actual schedule rather than just realizing, oh, wait, this bathroom is flooding all the time. Maybe we need to call a plumbing company. Right now, the board, who are supposed to direct the overall direction, like Crystal said, lead the co-op. When you are overwhelmed with other things to do, the strategic planning falls to the wayside. So I want to take a moment and pause. This presentation, or something like it, has been given many times before. As we showed in that history, people have written letters and histories of saying, hey, this was messed up, this issue happened. And we see those issues happening again and again. I'm sure those involved in leadership now see something similar. The question is, when people have said, oh, the co-op is not working as well as it should, what was the solution? Well, somehow the board would then have to take the R&D responsibility of restructuring all the co-op, thinking of a way that it works better, as well as restructuring their own internal dynamics to function more effectively, while also managing the dysfunctional load of work and responsibility that they have right now. Of course, we're not giving that presentation today. We would not come to you with this dire message that we find so important if we had not done our fair share of the heavy lifting. And with that, we move to part 3 of our presentation, where we are going to describe the alternative, the BOP, the balance of power model of governance. As you can see in the credits here, these reforms are drafted with the combined efforts of many past members who had extensive experience in co-op leadership. And most of this work was done over the year 2021 to 2022. So the first part that we should talk about in the BOP model is what we term shifting of responsibilities. We are going to get to some new actual bodies and even a new elected council that we are proposing. But for now, let's talk about the bodies that we all know and hopefully love. The board of directors, the membership committee, the ED, and their crews, right? The executive department. Sometimes we include employees as well. For the balance of power model, we took the philosophy of narrowing the function and the responsibilities of these 3 bodies and having them play to their strengths. In this case, this means that the board should function as legislators, which of course they already do. They write our rule book, but they have a lot of other things to do as well. The membership committee now should focus on being the co-op's judicial council, which is actually what the bylaws say is the purpose of the membership committee. And of course, the ED and crews, administrative and effectively bureaucratic personnel, these are the executive and operational specialists of the co-op, and their ability is best for carrying out administrative and logistical tasks. So if this is our philosophy, this is what we think the three current bodies of power in the co-op should really focus on, then how should we shift their responsibilities around? Well, first, we need to move the managing and appointing of crew chiefs from the board to the ED. Why is this change motivated? Well, a committee of students is frankly never the body that's going to be an effective manager. Not just because they're students. Any committee needs to meet weekly. They act very slowly on purpose because they should be doing long-term research before they make any decisions in terms of changing policies and their other responsibilities, overseeing a committee project, for instance. So in order to be an effective manager, you need to be able to make quick and cohesive decisions, right? How should a board member manage crew chiefs if they're responsible to? One director gets two crew chiefs and they all split up, well, then you'll have different standards of management. Just the president managing all the crew chiefs, of course, that's untenable. So we really think that the only path forward for coherent co-op governance is to say the ED will be the one to manage crew chiefs. The next change motivated, right? If the board is supposed to focus on legislation and creating and writing effective rules of the association, and as well as the long-term direction of the association, they can't be involved in high-intensity judicial cases. And this means that the summoning of grossly deficient and delinquent members should shift to MemCom. So again, as we said, if the MemCom is going to be the judicial council of the co-op, then they can really focus on making sure that judicial procedures, harassment hearings, expulsion hearings are carried out effectively, because that will be their focus. So if we move the summoning of grossly deficient members to MemCom, we can allow the board to, again, focus on being leaders rather than getting caught up in the minutia of a specific harassment case. And we can put that responsibility in a body that's focused on doing it very, very well. Of course, the question becomes, if we put all of the summoning into MemCom, is that fair? Is now MemCom going to be overwhelmed? Well, the solution, of course, is to realize that MemCom is tasked with highly complicated and nuanced administrative procedures in the current co-op. And what are those two processes MemCom has to do every quarter? Bump and elections. Bump and elections, of course, are very important to the function of the co-op, but they can be carried out by a specialized bureaucracy, right? If the rules are written properly and if the BOD and MemCom oversee the process, make sure it is carried out fairly, which we'll talk about more later, then the actual carrying out of it can be done by a crew under the purview of the ED. And we believe that this will actually result in less drama and less burnout with carrying out bump and election smooth implementation, because we can have a few members who are just dedicated to that. And now MemCom will have the space to focus and just train on doing effective, proper, and fair judicial processes rather than being completely distracted by these extremely complicated and strenuous processes twice a quarter. So the question becomes, if we move bump and if we move bump and elections to the ED and crews, well, who's going to carry it out? Obviously, the ED can't be carrying out himself, and to say another crew would do it would make no sense. Every other crew is very busy and has a lot of responsibilities already. So this means that we are proposing what tentatively we're calling the events crew, right? This could be maybe 3 or 4 members, maybe even one chief and one trustworthy member, something like that. This would be a new crew, of course, under the oversight of the ED. So the events crew would be responsible for organizing and carrying out the logistics of quarterly events, primarily bump and elections. But we also think maybe having them be responsible for orientation and sort of focusing on these 3 events would both justify their existence and make sure that these three events are carried out very well each quarter. And as I stated before, it's not like we're just going to say, oh, 3 or 4 short-shifted members are going to have complete reign over bump in elections. That would not be very well informed. That would not be very smart, right? So the BOD and MemCom, the democratic bodies of the co-op, will have to certify that the bump and elections processes were carried out faithfully, fairly, and in adherence to the rules and bylaws of the association. So in this slide, we want to talk a little bit more about the BOD specifics and why we think we really want to emphasize that the BOD should focus on legislative and fiduciary responsibilities, right? Fiduciary means to oversee our bank accounts, our expenditures, making sure that everything is balanced out. So as I've said before, and we're emphasizing here, the BOD very often in the current system acts as executives, right? Some sort of CEO, as well as justices and part of some sort of jury panel. And both by appointing and managing crew chiefs and by summoning members, sometimes for harassment cases, and very often for high deficiency cases. So the benefits of having BOD as legislators is that, and not as executive personnel, is that they can now write policies about how administrative tasks should be carried out, right? If you are responsible for appointing crew chiefs, as well as writing how crew chiefs should be appointed, you're not going to be very incentivized to make sure that that appointment and selection process was fair every time. Because it's a lot of work to make sure you're always doing something the same way. So again, this justifies that the BOD does not serve as these executive managers any longer. And about judicial matters, I want to take a moment and say that judicial matters are very serious. And when they're mishandled, we believe that they have some of the greatest capacity to disrupt the trust and the very sort of democratic fabric that the co-op is supposed to have. If you think you were fined unfairly, or you think your friend was expelled unfairly, you're not going to care, or you'll be very upset about it, and you won't really believe in the process. And democracy really depends on people believing in the process. So again, if the BOD and MemCom share judicial responsibility, then they will necessarily have differing standards of protocols and procedures, and that is already constitutes a basic injustice. Of course, beyond this, if the BOD is supposed to be overseeing possible expansion or planning out building renovations with the ED, then if they have to handle a very sensitive harassment case, this can completely wrest their attention for an entire quarter. And again, either they pay good attention to that judicial case and they renege their other responsibilities, or vice versa. They say, oh, whatever, I'll just go with what everybody says, this guy deserves a fine or something, and I'm going to focus on this committee I'm more interested in. So it just doesn't make sense to split these responsibilities and just have them overlapping as much as they currently are. Now that we've talked a little bit more about the specifics of why we think the changes to the board are motivated, and the changes in general, the question becomes who will keep tabs on the executive director and their department? Remember, we took 2 responsibilities out of the board, which meant that 2 got put into the ED. So how do we know that the ED and crew chiefs and maybe employees sometimes won't similarly, maybe abuse some power or not carry out responsibilities very fairly? Well, the answer to who will keep tabs on them is actually the same as it is right now. The board itself is always going to be the best body to oversee the functioning of an executive director. And this is true at, pretty much all nonprofits out there, as well as many for-profit companies as well. So again, the board now can focus on passing detailed, nuanced, and well-thought-out policies about how various tasks should be carried out. For instance, financial transparency, right? When money goes to the banks or if it's spent on a committee project, how should we make sure the members have access to that? Crew chief selection policy. Again, As an example, I talked about a bit in the last couple slides. Investments, elections, room changes, many things, everything about how the co-op functions. The board still writes the rules for how it should be done. They're just not the ones responsible for carrying it out. So they can more critically analyze and oversee how it's being carried out holistically in order to figure out, oh, maybe we should change something here or there. So we really want to emphasize why we think our proposed reforms will allow the board to effectively oversee the ED. In the current system, they had responsibility of overseeing 5 bodies, right? That's divided attention, an overwhelming amount of oversight. After shifting the responsibilities, we have narrowed the responsibility of the board and thus empowered it to effectively oversee the ED. So can this ever go wrong? Can the board, fail in checking the ED properly? Which, of course, many people would argue that has happened before already. Will our changes necessarily be foolproof? Well, of course, this could go wrong if the board becomes lethargic or if the membership is apathetic. So how do we fix this, right? How do we fix a board becoming lethargic, even if we have reduced all of its responsibilities? Well, the only way to stop that is to promote a culture of positive engagement. Again, so the question becomes, how do we promote positive engagement to prevent lethargy in our governance bodies? As I said before, engagement is damaged most when members perceive unfairness and bias in the co-op systems. Okay, and of course, if AMO gave you a wrong fine or didn't get your credit very fast, maybe you'll be upset. But the really big issues are when there's judicial controversies, right? As I said, if you have a fine you think is unfair, or someone got a harassment case you thought was, oh, just because MemCom didn't like this guy, or vice versa. They did not expel someone because you thought they liked him, even though that person deserved to be expelled. That destroys the democratic integrity that the co-op is supposed to have. And of course, you're not going to be positively engaged. So again, there can be cynicism in the co-op due to things like judicial controversies, but that can change. And the way we change it is by implementing judicial reforms to foster trust. So the next part of describing the BOP model will be about the new bodies that we are introducing, that we have drafted to flesh out the judicial system of UCHA and hopefully prevent, controversies and unfairness from happening again, or make sure it doesn't happen, whether it's happened in the past or not. So with that, I'm going to hand off the presentation to Derek, who will talk about these reforms.
Okay, hi everybody. I am Derek. First of all, thanks a lot to Taylor for his part of the presentation. It was really good. And now I would like to talk about the last part of our presentation, which is judicial reforms. So, as Taylor has already said, judicial reforms are key to building that culture of positive engagement. And in turn, the culture of positive engagement is key to ensuring that the board is held accountable, that the ED is held accountable, that everyone is held accountable, and that we have this healthy organization. So how do we do that? How do we carry out judicial reforms? Well, we plan to establish 2 new bodies, namely the Ombudsman and an appeal panel, in order to essentially flesh out or complete our judicial process and make sure that it is fair. So first, let me start with the problem. What is wrong with our judicial system? And this is from our description of the balance of power model. And I read, we observe that the main contradiction within the co-op judicial system is the accumulation of unchecked powers by MemCom. It is simultaneously the investigator, prosecutor, judge, jury, and attorney in the co-op judicial process. At the same time, MemCom is also expected to guarantee member rights. Now, the clear issue here is that there is a lot of different roles that MemCom is asked to perform, and all the while, no one is making sure that they are doing this in a way that is in accordance with co-op regulations, rules, and due process. So we visualize we visualize the Ombudsman and the appeals panel, the two new bodies that we are proposing, as essentially part of this triangle, which we're calling the Judicial Triangle, that will eventually serve to complete this otherwise currently incomplete model of having one body doing everything. And this is a rudimentary model of the Judicial Triangle, and you will see this becoming fleshed out and more complete as we go. But for now, you can see the two bodies and the rough role that we're expecting them to play, with the appeals panel ensuring these decisions, judicial decisions in the co-op, are procedurally valid, just and fair, and consistent with past rulings, precedents, and the Ombudsman being an advocate for members' rights. These two will complement the membership committee in making sure that our judicial process will be fair. So I will start with the Ombudsman, which we call the star of the show. So this is, as I've already mentioned, the current way things are done, which is you have a membership committee serving as the ultimate judicial council in the UCHA, that they play these different roles, and there isn't really an effective appeals process. We see the Ombudsmen, plural, because we believe that it should be a multi-member elected council. The details still need to be fleshed out. But we see the Ombudsmen essentially as public attorneys. They serve this role of, they have these expert knowledge in co-op affairs. They know the rules, they know the bylaws, they know how things are done. They've done their research. And they are the ones who are really empowered to speak on behalf of members who are facing accusations or issues, facing potential punishment. They are really the ones who are empowered to speak on their behalf, to present that defense, and to make sure that things are done fairly, that the process is being followed, that all the rules are being followed, and ultimately everyone, that the defendants get a fair process. So this may sound antagonistic, but the Ombudsman really helps both the board and MemCom. And we say that because the Ombudsman, ultimately, if they do their job properly, will increase members' trust in the co-op's judicial processes. Because as Taylor's mentioned, at the moment, when you have a body responsible for all aspects of the co-op judiciary, and there isn't another body that could really effectively counter it, which we'll go into more depth later, you always have this issue of members say, well, they're just biased, that they only care about their friends, that, fairly or unfairly, people are going to have less trust in the process. And when these really contentious issues, which I'm sure all of you have memories of and have experience with, I myself can think of many. When I was on MemCom, I was MemCom chair for more than a year. We had to deal with some very contentious issues, really, really divisive, you could say. And the co-op is split into camps of pro this, pro that, anti this, anti that, and they're all accusing each other of bias. They're saying this is corrupt. Trust is essential to our cooperative. Trust is essential to our democratic procedure, and the Ombudsman can play that role of making sure there is trust. They do so by engaging with members. As you can see on the right, we have a list of some of the tentative ideas or roles that the Ombudsman is expected to fulfill. They are supposed to be in constant communication with the membership, especially membership who have issues, members who have found themselves at the wrong end of the UCHA rules, who have gotten a summons on their door. They're supposed to know a lot. They're supposed to be experts on co-op policies and rules, especially when it comes to member rights and penalties. They're supposed to provide reports to the membership about things going on in the co-op. So because they are the ones who know so much and they attend meetings, and by doing so, they ensure there's transparency in co-op governance. And we've talked about transparency a lot, both ourselves, but also I've heard many people talk about transparency. Every time you ask people what can be improved about this place in terms of governance, they say transparency. But how do you do that? You do that by making sure there is this group of people, the ombudsman, who know what they're talking about, who goes to the meetings, and who can provide this neutral voice. They will have access to certain executive items, and they can read those, and they can make sure that things are not being abused, right? So this is what we think the ombudsman will do. And now I will move on to talk about the appeals panel. So currently, the co-op's appeal pathway is something like this. You have the membership committee, which oversees or hears most of the cases in the co-op. And then the board, according to the rules, have this power to choose to rehear or to, you could say, appeal MemCom's decision. You also have in the rules, strangely enough, an option for MemCom to rehear their own decision. MemCom has no power to ever hear board decisions. That is to say, if the board takes up a case and then it makes a decision, that is final. MemCom has no power to rehear that. The issue with this current system, besides being very confusing, is that if you have an issue, you can either take it up with MemCom or you can take it up with the board, because the board actually, according to the rules, have the same powers in terms of judicial matters. That is to say, the board can choose to take up cases without communicating with MemCom. They can just say, this is going to be our case now, and that decision becomes final. There is no appeal pathway for it. So if you're a member and you have an issue, you're inclined to choose the body that is more sympathetic to you. But if you're, say, on the board and you take up a case, you essentially deny that member the right to appeal, because you have basically skipped the membership committee stage of the process. So the appeals panel will resolve this issue by essentially connecting both the board and MemCom in a way that is clear, in a way that is fair, and in a way that will resolve the current, you could say, mess that is our judicial process. Appeals panel will be the final appeal body, whereas MemCom will then take on all of the primary judicial matters. The board will withdraw entirely from this process, at least in the initial stage. So every time there's a rule violation, every time someone complains about their roommates, MemCom will be the first body they meet. MemCom will be the first body to take up on that. There will no longer be people choosing which body to go to depending on who they like more. There will no longer be the board taking up a case and denying the member appeals right. Instead, they will all go to MemCom. Now, if people are unsatisfied with MemCom's decision, they can choose to appeal. However, not every case should be appealed. That would be too much. Instead, the board will then decide whether or not an appeal is granted. That is to say, whether or not they choose to convene this appeals panel. And the appeals panel, the separate body, third body, will then rehear MemCom's initial decision, and based on their assessment of that decision and the evidence of the case, choose to whether to overrule or not. So what is the appeals panel? What is it going to be made out of? So this is still in the air. And at this current stage, we have two, you could say, alternatives to choose from. One is on the left here, you see jury, which is essentially a group of members selected at random, with, of course, some caveats such as seniority requirements or disinterest, no conflict of interest, and also perhaps giving both sides of a dispute certain numbers of strikes that they can use to make sure that they can that ultimately the jury selected is acceptable to both parties. However, there are of course real logistical challenges with that. It's never been done before in the co-op. This will require members to be trained. This will require members to be confidential. This will also require members to know about that they may be selected for jury duty and to actually show up. So there's logistical challenges. And that's why we propose also an alternative, which is essentially a BOD-ED MemCom joint council. And here you see this so-called alternate panel, which is a body that was drafted by Therese, our lawyer, Woody, the executive director, and Indro as the board president and his board back in fall 2021. they wrote up a document detailing what's called an alternate panel for harassment cases. And essentially it will be composed of members of the board selected by the president. It will be composed of the executive director, and it will also be composed of the MemCom chair. And together, this will become the so-called alternate panel that would have the right to hear harassment cases. So we got inspiration from that, and we think we can definitely make this work. This is still in the air, and this is definitely going to be a conversation that we need to have. So with the appeals panel, the judicial triangle is now complete. And you can see the sort of role the appeals panel is supposed to play here. By having an appeals panel, you ensure ultimately that all cases have the right to appeal, have this pathway to appeal. Another very important part of his job is going to be reviewing relevant past cases, precedents, and also to make sure that there is proper documentation for all decisions and rationale for decision, and ultimately rule on whether or not the original hearing was fair, if any new facts have been found that is relevant, and if the original decision was fair and consistent with UCHA practices. And with the appeals panel's decision, this becomes precedence for the future, because people are going to look back at this and say, well, there was a case back then that was very similar and had this decision and outcome. So that's why we believe that documentation especially is very important, that everything has to be written down. And with this completed judicial triangle, I will move on to put that, or you could say put that in context with this balance of power model that we've created. And you can see here on the left, we have the operational / executive portions of the UCHA, with the executive director as the head of operations, employees and crew chiefs, etc. You can see it's very hierarchical. It's based on chain of command and chain of responsibility, which is what you want for an operational task. On the right, you have the legislative / judicial portions of the UCHA, with this focus on cross-checking, with this focus on checks and balances and separation of power. And in the center, you can see how they're connected by the board as the ultimate corporate authority. Membership is foundational, of course, to all of this. They are the ones who make sure that the place runs, and they're the ones who will eventually be tasked, or they were the ones who will fill these leadership positions. Here you have the descriptions of jobs or jurisdiction and responsibilities of the different bodies. In red, you can see what we call overlapping jurisdiction. They're not inherently bad. Just because there is overlapping jurisdiction doesn't mean that it is not good, so long as those overlapping jurisdictions have clear division of labor, clear division of role between different bodies. These are, of course, discussions and documents that will need to be written in greater detail in the future. But for now, you can see our effort to create this comprehensive description of different parts of this UCHA, different parts of the leadership. Now, I will compare that with what we call the de facto model, which again, as Taylor mentioned, is in the cafeteria. This is, as of now, essentially what is going on. And you can see the main issue with this is there's very little cross-checking, except for the board. Most bodies don't talk to each other very much. And ultimately, everything is dependent on the board, right? Which is why there's so much burnout. Bodies do their own thing without really anyone else checking their work. And you can see underneath with the jurisdiction and responsibilities that there's a lot more overlapping areas. And where there is overlap, there isn't a clear understanding of procedure. There isn't a clear understanding of division of labor. With this, I want to go back to the Garlo letter, which we mentioned from the beginning. The letter titled Look to the Future, Please essentially asks that we need to focus on strategy. We need to focus on the bigger things. We need to focus on principle. That leadership isn't management, right? Management is making sure things are running, is making sure the day-to-day. But leadership is about more than that. Leadership is about getting together and thinking about the bigger questions of what are we and what do we want to be. We see the balance of power governance model particularly the reduction in the executive and judicial responsibilities of the board, as this one pathway to enable leadership and to enable the best leadership we can have here. And the way I think of this is that you have principles. You have essentially have several tiers of leadership. You have principle, that is to say, what is the fundamental idea and philosophy of this place? And in these co-op, we know what that is. It's cooperative principles. We have democracy. We have membership engagement. We have membership leadership. You also have what's called strategy. Strategy is how you achieve those principles. These are questions of expansion. These are questions of major overhauls and reforms. You have policies, one tier down, which is how do you put those strategy into practice? These are in the form of what's called investment policies. These are things like judicial policies, rules. These are all policies, how things are done. And then at the end of policy, at the lower tier of that, you have implementation, people who actually put those into practice. And for people like the board of directors, for bodies like membership committee, they need to be operating on a higher level. And so our request, we have this unique opportunity to really transform the co-op. We have this unique opportunity to really rethink how this place is and how this place is run. But for that, we will need investment. The governance committee, which has already been reconstituted, can be the spearhead of this project. It can be this body where all of those thoughts are gathered together, where the conversations that we need to have is being had. But we need investment. Ideally, we want to see a good mix of different people participating in governance committee. We need short-shifted members, people who are dedicated to the operation of the committee. We need directors from the board, and we definitely need MemCom members, because we will need all stakeholders to be part of this, and many more. This is not complete. The board would, of course, need to routinely make sure that things are being done, that progress is being made. And with that, I want to also talk about what we think is the best order of reforms. Do note that these are all tentative, and is not meant to be prescriptive. However, our goal here is to start this conversation that we desperately need in order so that different stakeholders can participate, in order so that we can eventually come to some kind of agreement. So reinstate GovCom is our top priority, which has been done. We believe next that we should start working on the operational aspects and the operational department of the UCHA. With the executive director as operational head, crew chief management, we need to establish events crew, which Taylor's already talked about. This is responsible for overseeing, essentially taking away the operational side, operational tasks from the membership committee so that they can focus on judicial matters. We want to establish the Ombudsman Council, and we want to establish the appeals panel, completing the Judicial Triangle. So with that, I would like to end today's presentation. Again, as you can see, this work has been the product of many generations of co-opers going back years. Many of those people are no longer with us. Some are still here. And I want to really thank all of the people who have worked on this. I really want to thank all the people who have put in their valuable time, their valuable effort and energy into building this, into having this conversation, into contributing their energy and contributing their thoughts. And of course, this is not going to be the complete list, because there's going to be many more people who will continue to work on this even long after we're gone. So with that, thank you very much for listening to our presentation. This has been me, Derek, and Taylor, and Crystal. And yeah, I will stop sharing. Taylor, would you like to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to give a shout out to, of course, you, Derek, and Crystal for putting in so much work to this as well. I mean, you guys definitely have been amazing to this whole process, and it obviously there would be no presentation today if you two weren't part of it. So thanks for that.
Oh, I'm so proud of you guys. It was like so nice. It was like heartwarming to watch.